It seems that today is the opportunity for people not only to come and speak, but to have somebody significant with them, because following on from Saul Marks and his father's presence, Miriam Rodriguez Pereira, who's the honorary archivist of the Spanish and Portuguese Sephardi community, is here today, which when we... Many of you will have corresponded with Miriam over the years, and she should really be giving this talk, but it at least gives you a somewhat more sporting chance of having your questions answered at the end, if she's with us. I took advice on the presentation here from my favorite resident computer expert. In the way of our favorite resident computer expert, he's disappeared back off to university without telling me that doing it on Keynote rather than PowerPoint would mean that the slides come up double. So at the moment, I can only see one slide at a time. You can see two. So for anybody who has always wanted to feel that they're a step ahead of the presenter, this is your day. So the date 1656 is, of course, familiar to everybody from when we celebrated 350 years anniversary some years ago. There was, of course, prior to 1656, a small community here, but not a very official one. And as we know, for instance, in the case of Queen Elizabeth's doctor, it was not necessarily a story that ended happily. Then Antonio Carvajal had actually gone through the very considerable procedure of being a denizen, of acquiring citizenship. He no longer needed citizenship, but he supported the arrival of, and I'm very aware that this story will be very familiar to very many of you, but I thought I'd start by recapping the early history of the community briefly. He supported Manasseh ben Israel's petition to Cromwell. If we come across to the next slide, you can see the petition to Cromwell on the side. There was a decision that the Jews had been asked to leave in 1290. That was not a prohibition on them living there in the future. And there wasn't, as Cromwell had hoped, an official, yes, the Jews can come back, but there was a sort of tacit recognition that this is sort of okay. And by December of 1656, Antonio Carvajal had rented a house in Christchurch Lane. And of course, what's the other essential for Jewish life, and we'll see later, the cemetery that they also took out a lease for came into use just a few months later. In Christchurch Lane, they developed a house into a synagogue. If you look at Wilfrid Samuel's book on Christchurch Lane as the first London synagogue, that's got plans of before it was converted for synagogue use. What is the essential difference? They put in a kitchen, but they also converted the first floor for use for services. Some of you will have come across John Greenhalgh's interesting letter about, a very long letter, about how interesting he found it being at a Jewish service, or of course he deplored the fact that they didn't properly recognize his Lord and Savior as their God. If you look at this brief explanation of the structure of the community, they very consciously modeled themselves after their predecessors in Venice, their predecessors in Amsterdam, who had earlier set up a community of those who had left Spain and Portugal. And you need a constitution if you're to function as a community. The Spanish and Portuguese community to this day talk about, well, is it in the Ascamot? And each AGM, more Ascamot are passed or not. But they had to start somewhere, and they started with a set of 42, declaring the authority of the Muhammad. various threads can be seen running through. The basic is how they were to organize themselves, function as a community, remain solvent as a community, provisions for giving charity, which was a very significant early part of the congregation's life. But a lot of the Ascomot, you can see a certain fear that their position was not too secure, and there is a running theme of not doing anything that would arouse scandal in the wider community. So the regulations, for instance, against performing conversions were in case that they were accused of missionizing in a wider sense, and that weakened their position. So, if you want to study the original Ascomot and you have very good Portuguese, then this will soon be available via the Central Archive for the History of Jewish People in Jerusalem. For those who find the original handwriting difficult, although in fact it's amazingly clear, I think, and whose Portuguese is not perhaps at the first level, the Ascomot and the early years of accounts were in fact published and are easily available in English. You can actually read for yourself the whole of the Ascomot. You can also see, by going through the early accounts, who was doing well financially, because any synagogue treasurers here? I don't know what your chances are of getting the entire congregation to declare their income to you, but one of the funding streams for the community, the imposter, was a charge on a percentage of business transactions undergone. And so you can see who is indeed doing well, who doing less well, by the amount of imposter that was paid in by members of the congregation. And you can also see the congregation growing. Now, I was asked to talk about the material produced by the Sephardic community for research, and I'm sure many of you here will be familiar with the volumes of Bevis Marks records. So the first volume deals with the early history of the community. There was a census in 1684, at which point there were 414 members of what they called the nation. And you can see from the way that Church Lane had to be expanded to seat more people, having made a synagogue area on the first floor. They then opened up the second. It's as if we took a bite out of the ceiling here and had a gallery looking down from whatever is on the floor above, which would no doubt inconvenience the Jewish Museum greatly. And it's interesting, I think, to note, given the controversy there was in certain areas of the community about membership of synagogues for women in the 20th century, to notice that there are some widows and so on listed here as part of the nation, and that's already in 1684 among the Sephardim, who I must say do not normally have a reputation for advanced thinking in feminist areas. Still, you can see that there were women members of the nation at that stage, if you look at the names of the widows on that list. And the continuing Inquisition, and the Inquisition continued a great deal longer than, that's right, the Monty Python jokes would have us think, meant that, like the community in Holland and in other places, the community continued to grow. Lisbon became a free port early in the 18th century, which meant the British Navy was regularly visiting there, and rather unofficially, that became a channel for bringing people directly from Portugal to this country, although other people arrived from South America, from Holland. There was a lot of travel to and fro between the community here and the community in Holland, and you can see that it's very easy to see that toing and froing by following families between our records, birth, marriages direct, and those in Holland. So Christchurch Lane wasn't big enough anymore. And yes, having said synagogue treasurers, anybody involving in synagogue building appeals may, that's right, look longingly at the sums mentioned here. One of the things, now I'm sure, perhaps I shouldn't even be mentioning this, because anybody who is knowledgeable enough and interested enough to be a member of the JGSGB is not, will probably not make this mistake. But Miriam and I get a constant stream of inquiries to the archives where people assume that, oh yes, my ancestor was here in 1720. He must have been a member of your synagogue. My ancestor lived just round the corner from Bevis Marks, very near indeed, on Duke's Place. He must have been a member of your synagogue. And of course, it ain't necessarily so. That although it was the Sephardim who came here first, having opened the open door then became an entrance for many more people arriving. And yes, so the first cemetery was Sephardi, but very soon there was a Ashkenazi cemetery. The person, in fact, who purchased the land in Alderney Road for the Ashkenazi cemetery had for many years attended Christchurch Lane. His name turns up in those imposter records, and so on. Many people, however, once there were Ashkenazi synagogue, moved across, and we all know about Jewish communities. There were some Ashkenazim who went native, as it were, into the nation, but there were also stages when there was concern about these Ashkenazi members coming in, or Tudeskos, as they're known in the local vernacular, and that was the stage when there started to be separate Ashkenazi synagogues. If you've got somewhere else you can go to, seemed to be almost the feeling behind it. And yes, if you look at the foundation date of the Duke's Place synagogue, if you'll forgive me allow me to give a private hobby horse a brief canter, people are very fond of saying that Bevis Marks is the longest running synagogue in the country. I wish they wouldn't say that, because as you all know, it really is only thanks to the Luftwaffe taking out Duke's Place that it's possible for anyone to say that. Bevis Marks records too list marriages from the very early stages. We very often get people saying, well, can I see the ketubah? Often thinking that there will be more information on the ketubah. And in fact, the very few years I've been volunteering in the archives, I have nothing but admiration for those who earlier enthusiasts for the community's history who worked in the Spanish and Portuguese communities' archives and produced these books of records, the marriages. In a minute we'll get to the other volumes. The information that you will find on the ketubah is there in the books. You may not find out that more. So, yes, if you look at a page taken, I can't say entirely at random, because I was looking for a page that had several examples of, if you see there are several couples where this is two people with the same surname. They will have been living in Portugal as a officially Christian family. They will not have been able to have a Jewish wedding. And when they arrived in London and joined the community, then you can map in the early circumcision records, circumcisions taking place, and then a remarriage taking place. So the people who are categorized as Vindos de Portugal are those who had arrived from Portugal. Other couples you can see there, this is not a remarriage, but a wedding taking place from scratch. And as I said, the information in the volumes of Bevis marks is the information there from the Ketubah. This is Moses Montefiore's Ketubah. While we're on the subject of mixed Sephardi and Ashkenazi marriages, there's no doubt that they did take place, and in fact, as we all know, Moses Montefiore was quite keen that other people should follow his good example in this respect. If you're looking for the information on a ketubah, you can see down in the bottom corner by his signature, I don't know whether people can see clearly enough, his signature in the corner, Moses Montefiore. Underneath it says Novio. A few of the ketubot say Khatan, but many of them say Novio. And then there's aid and aid in the middle for the witnesses. Bevis marks records 3, which is marriages from 1837 onward. They contain a lot more information under each entry. So rather than, okay, we all know how, I imagine that everybody here can, that's right, do the necessary figures for conversion of numbers. With Bevis marks records 3, you don't have to. No more adding 240. The date in English is given, the names of both fathers, the age of bride and groom, their profession, father's profession, the address, where the wedding took place, names of witnesses, additional sums pledged. So somebody earlier mentioned the variety of jobs done by members of the community. A quick look at Bevis marks 3, as well as listing marriages, is a good way of finding out what jobs people had. A few go in just as gentlemen, but many other specify. You can also see there was a period when almost all marriages took place at home. Then suddenly it was considered that the homes weren't so appropriate. Marriages started taking place in the synagogue. At a couple of services a couple of years ago, a visiting speaker said, "My family was the first to get married at Lauderdale Road Synagogue," and somebody sitting just behind me said, "Oh no, they weren't, mine were." And a quick check in Bevis Mark's synagogue proved that the speaker was the optimist and the mutterer behind me was the one whose family tradition was slightly more accurate in this regard. Bevis Mark's 4 is a circumcision list. It also has some female births. There was a record of births kept more recently, but once people actually took out a civil birth certificate, they became less likely to register births with the congregation. Historically, they were more likely to recognize the birth with the synagogue. The circumcisions that took place, as you can see from the ages given on this slide, as I said, obviously many of them were of small children, but they were also people coming in as adults needing to be circumcised, having not had that done as children. Bevis Marks 5 is also a cluster of circumcision registers. I think the next slide is probably the one about which we get most inquiries. You can see Benjamin Disraeli, daughter of Isaac and Maria, and if you notice his grandparents, also Benjamin and Sarah. The P and M in brackets stand for Padrino and Madrino. His grandparents were his godparents. There is, I think, a certain interest in some parts of the Jewish community in proving how Jewish Benjamin Disraeli still was, and somebody did actually ask to know who else had been circumcised at the same time, who would be his Jewish cohort, which was a nice idea, and we did actually take the information out of the circumcision register for him. I don't know whether he was really brought up enough in the Jewish community to make this as realistic as our inquirer hoped. Bevis Mark 6, Bevis Mark's record 6 we'll come to in a moment, is a register of burials, but quite separate from the Bevis Mark's record series. There is also a listing of burials at the Veio, or Old Cemetery. This is the one that we saw earlier when we were looking at history, when Antonio Carvajal rented land for a cemetery out at Mile End. So this was actually published by the Jewish Historical Society's Miscellanies, and yes, I do have some of these with me if anybody wants to come and ask me about them during the next break. So they rented the cemetery early in 1657, and the first burial took place in Elul of that year. And Antonio Carvajal, who'd founded the cemetery, sad to say, was unfortunately sooner than expected buried there himself. Any enthusiastic readers of Samuel Pepys's diaries here? Oh, run there. And actually, right, I shouldn't have said his diaries. This turns up in a letter rather than in the diaries. But having rather triumphantly survived an operation for stone himself, he came to the Shloshim for Antonio Carvajal, who had not survived an operation by the same surgeon. The Veio register, all these registers have an alphabetical list at the back, and then listings as you go. The term angelito is used for child burials. There are sadly an awful lot of those listed in the register. The cemetery, at the stage when it was largely closed, there were a few more burials in reserved spaces, and Chacham Maldola very much wanted to be buried with Chacham Nieto, the congregation's, one of the congregation's early Chachamim, and the cemetery was opened in order to do that. Bevis Mark's record 6 lists the burials in the Nuevo, or New Cemetery. And I don't know how many people here have been out to Mile End Road or have studied or attended lectures at Queen Mary's University College, which is in effect, oh yes, hands going up here, right, yes. So I think it was a bit of a medieval thing, wasn't it? A memento mori, a sense that you should be reminded of death in life. And Queen Mary's University College is really, because it's built round part of the new cemetery, it is indeed a very vivid reminder of the existence of death in the middle of life and learning. The two cemeteries very near to each other. A set of rules were drawn up for the cemetery keeper. As you can see, one of them was keeping a proper cemetery list, which was done. Again, it's really pretty legible, but it doesn't exactly hurt that these days it can be found in nice, neat typescript. I think you can see it, although I can't yet, over on the far side. You can also see that in those days, that's right, if these days this country, we usually have a stone that records in both Hebrew and English. In those days, it was Portuguese that was on the other part of the stone. And yes, burials are listed. You can see how people would reserve graves so that there's the odd burial for later date, although most of them are running through in chronological order. And we also rather sadly learned a few months ago that, of course, burial in a reserved grave. Somebody was inquiring about being able to find their grandparents' graves, their grandmother, or yes, allow a few extra greats in there, could you? Their great-great-grandma had been buried in the Nuevo because some of the graves were moved away and reburied to make room for Queen Mary's University campus. At her date of burial, her grave should have been there, but because she'd been buried in the reserved site next to her husband, you would, wouldn't you? Her grave was not, in fact, still extant. If you look in Bevis Marks Record 6, the abbreviations for months are mostly entirely recognizable. One slight warning, the one, if you look through quickly, that might snag an observer at first sight. Adar, yes, fine, but then an entry under V for and Adar, for those years when there's an Adar Sheni, is, I think, the only one of those that might be a catch for the unwary. Separately from the listings by row, you've got a listing, a detail of those ones where there's a full and legible epitaph. I thought it would be nice to have a brief example of tracing a family back rather than just saying, there are the records. So let's have a look at the Lialta family. Sorry? That's your, yeah, right, okay. I realized that I was taking a risk with practically anyone we picked. Right, well, so if you've also gone through this journey, you can probably talk through these entries more effectively than I can. Because of the way that the entries in Bevis Marks records are spread out over a double page, there was no way I could photograph them and have them show up on screen at any site that was assigned. So, yes, number 693 gives details of Joseph Lialta's second marriage to Phoebe Isaacs. We get names of their fathers. And when it says, yes, Joseph Lialta, the phrase that's used changes slightly. One of them is described as a carcass butcher. At another occasion, he's described as a master butcher. I'm not quite sure what the difference is, but clearly the same family. One of the marriages took place in a pub, apparently. This was before marriage in the synagogue became so universal. The other thing that stands out quite dramatically in entry 693 is that the amount added to the ketubah was £500. And that's a fantastical amount. Normally, it's 50 or whatever, even for very wealthy families. I don't know whether that was a sign of that he did not plan to make a habit of entry 397 refers to his first marriage, and he is listed in 600 and for his later marriage as having been divorced. So it's possible this fantastically large amount was a way of saying he did not intend to repeat his earlier events. But if we want then to go back to the previous generation, then we do indeed get Isaac, his father Isaac's marriage, and to Laura. And interestingly, the listing suggests this may have been a remarriage. We don't have their ages, just a little thing that they were definitely adult at the time. So even in these what look like quite bold and brief listings, it's amazing how much information has been packed in. So we have an 1878 marriage, and if the register ends at 1901, there might well not have been a chance for the family to get another generation tucked in before the end of the printed list. Then back to the previous, his earlier marriage a few years before, the father's marriage, and of course going back from 49, that's going to take us back into Bevis Marks Records 2, where we have rather less information available for each marriage, but we do at least have the date. And we know that an Isaac, son of Uzziel, got married. And we know that another Isaac, the son of Uzziel, got married But we do seem to be missing a generation, although this is a nice, clear record. However, we do also know that the previous generations of the family, and Miriam worked this one out with great care, because it came to us as an inquiry to the archives, which, yes, immediately after Brexit, we had a sudden spike in people suddenly very interested indeed in their Sephardi ancestry, because the change of rules that enabled people to apply for a Spanish or Portuguese passport as a measure of contrition for what had happened in 1492 and afterwards. I think we'd had, what, about half a dozen takers before the Brexit vote, and suddenly a lot of people were very interested in their ancestry indeed. So Miriam carefully worked this one back and found out that the previous generations had been in Amsterdam. We need an Uziel, son of Isaac, in there somewhere, probably Amsterdam also, to complete the chain going back. But so this is how you can use the index to look up examples to trace the line back through the generations. Yes, I don't know whether it's just as they appear in our records or a general thing about the family. They seem to have had helpfully small families, which does rather help the searching process compared with when you have a very large number of siblings. Now, right, it doesn't seem to be moving on mine, though it still seems to be on there. Right, I said that the Lealtads were easy because there aren't very many of them. If you have a look at the slide I can't see, but that you can see over to the far side, this is, I think, taken from our handwritten marriage register that dates from the mid-19th century. So the Garcias are not such a select entity in the congregation as the Lealtads. So faced with a list like that, it is, I think, a matter of temperament whether you slam the book shut and give up on the idea, help yourself to a large whiskey, or say, it may be a challenge, but I am going to do it. If you opt for the last option, then something that can be incredibly helpful in searching out the steps between entries in the marriage register is counter-checking entries in the birth circumcision register, because then if you get entry a couple of years after a marriage with the parents' names both listed as they are there, both the same, then that will give you the age of the child, which you can then double-check against the next marriage entry to check that you've got the same name, same age going with the name. Might not matter at all in the case of the Lealtads, but if you have a family like Garcia and several tracks of Garcias down, then if they're all naming their sons, their firstborn sons after their grandfathers, you can get an awful lot of repetition of similar names. And it's that combination of father's name plus mother's name plus age that means that you can anchor it a bit more. Although I should also say that another problem, going back, in fact, tracing the Garcia family, spoiler alert, is that because more than one family of Garcias arrived with similar first names for the husband as Vindos de Portugal from Iberia, it's in fact impossible in the last couple of generations to say who is derived from which of these families, although there's clearly a lovely secure back to Portugal line there in one form or another. Now, I'm not quite sure why the slides are refusing to turn at this point, why it's jammed in, but I think after that I was going to, yes, it seems right, turns up at the bottom, right. So the remaining piece of information in my brief from Martin was to talk to you about what's been published from the Spanish and Portuguese records. But the other thing was to talk about, well, what is there that researchers can find if they go and look at the London Metropolitan Archives? And that tiny little note down at the bottom, which you have we got it? No. That tiny little note down at the bottom, which you could see. Miriam and I are volunteers. We have another volunteer Edgar Samuel with an enormous background knowledge in the history of the Sephardi community in this country. We're volunteers and we come in 1 day a week. People who want to research our material, and we get a lot of scholars over from America in the summer who spend their summer's freedom from teaching in American universities, researching through our material. If they're coming over to America, they want to be able to access everything day by day. And so a very large amount of our material has been moved out, as with many other congregations, to the care of the London Metropolitan Archives. Yes, I was having a conversation over the lunch break with somebody about how... Oh, right. So, yes. Oh, thank you. Yes, right. 20th second records. The published Bevis Marks records, thank you, Lee. The published Bevis Marks records go back to about 1901. They mostly end at around that date. And, of course, people have been doing all the things that get registered in genealogical records, like being born and getting married and dying, during the rather more than 100 years since. We do have a register of marriages. We do have a birth record, although, as I said, once the institution of birth certificates, part of the national, came in, people were less likely to register children with the synagogue. We do have Hebrew records. Unfortunately, although Miriam says that her father, who was minister at Ramsgate, kept detailed records of who got every mitzvah during services, those have been lost. The Bevis Marks records also don't survive, but if you want to know who was called up at Lauderdale Road at any date over the last long while, and those records are still carefully kept by the Shamash to this day, then we can look those up for you. If I can have a brief personal diversion before we have time for questions. I read in a book about the Bentwich family that Josie Bentwich, who was a cousin of my grandmother's, had had his bar mitzvah at Lauderdale Road. And I thought that's funny, he never mentioned that. And went back and looked in the records for that period. I knew that his father had been friendly with Hacham Gaster, who was minister at that point. And I could see from the records of who got which mitzvah when, that he and his brother were obviously around. Occasionally they were listed as having been involved, bells and bands, dressing and undressing the scrolls. But he had not, unless somebody blinked in the recording, had a bar mitzvah there. The other thing I was very moved at looking around them, because those records were during the First World War. It was recorded, by the way, during the First World War. Miriam's also done some research and written a paper on this. When somebody who was on leave from serving in the forces was called up wearing uniform, it was also listed by the record of the mitzvah in khaki, or occasionally, that's right, in Navy uniform. So if you want to know about things that happened in the last century and therefore not in Bevis Marks records, please write to us. What about the material that was moved to the London Metropolitan Archives? Well, we have applied for a Rothschild grant. I said that we'd already, as well as conserving, digitized the first Ascamot and first financial records. But we're hoping to digitize and make available enormously more. Treasurer's records, that will give, as a way of also seeing who's a member. The hospital started by the congregation. It's not the first hospital, but it's an early hospital, and it's got interesting records. The school started by the congregation. Again, the girls' school was not the earliest girls' school in the country, but it's unusually early for a girls' school. A lot of material that we hope, but we won't know until January, we will, thanks to Rothschild, be able to make available to you in the comfort of your sitting room without having to trek down to the London Metropolitan Archive. But if you do want to go and see what's in the London Metropolitan Archive, you do need Miriam's permission. So please write to us. Please be patient if you don't get an immediate reply, because we're only volunteers. We come in 1 day a week. We do our best to stay abreast of correspondence, but all it takes is a month like Tishrei this year, when there's a whole lot of Yontov on Monday, or a year when Pesach comes out on Mondays, rapidly followed by May full of bank holidays, and we do sometimes get a bit behind. So if we haven't answered, email again, be patient with us, and we will try and get back to you. Okay, so any questions? Yes.
I've used the records to find the ketubah of my 4 times great-grandparents, 1777.
Mm-hmm.
The surname of the bride was indecipherable.
Mm-hmm.
The surname of the bride was indecipherable, and so a name was put in as perhaps being a bit like it, Shaw. The ketubah has been sent to Jerusalem. The rabbis there can't decipher it. Mm-hmm. But it's occurred to me, as her name was Esther de Mose something, mm-hmm. would a way forward be to look to see marriages of a previous generation where someone called Mose something or other got married? How am I going to get past this brick wall?
Miriam, what do you think?
Sorry,
Could you
yeah,
try?
Miriam, you sent me that ketubah, and you explained about the difficulty why the unlikely name of Shaw was there. And since then, I've sent it to various people, and it was finally sent to someone in Jerusalem, and they say they can't decipher it. So how am I going to get past this? If she was English born, would her parents' marriage perhaps be some years earlier?
So she was Esther de Moshe.
Yes.
So the problem, as I've got Bevis Mark's marriages too with me. Yes. You're very welcome, especially give me time to grab a cup of tea first, if we have a look together during the tea break. Yes. But I have to say, if that means that we're basically looking at anybody whose first name was Moshe, we may find ourselves rather busy.
Well, we think that Esther was 17 when she got married.
Sorry?
We think Esther was about 17.
Right. Okay.
So the marriage would have probably been sometime 1755 onwards.
1755 to 60. Let's have a look. We'll have a look later and see what we can do.
You've had a lot of references to the Sephardi community in Amsterdam. There was one in The Hague, but I've never seen anything in this country that refers to the Sephardi community in The Hague. Can you say anything about it?
No, I can't. Miriam, over to you again. References to Amsterdam, but there was also a Sephardi community in The Hague. There were Sephardi communities in quite a lot of places. And there's one in Hamburg, which also tends not to get a mention. Hamburg not being a very Sephardi place.
My grandfather was a chief rabbi of The Hague, but there must be some records there. I don't know anything about them, but the Amsterdam ones are in the municipal archives. They have transferred them all into the municipal archives, and they are very well maintained there. So Amsterdam you could certainly get, but I'm not sure about The Hague, I'm sorry. But they would know, I presume, if you ask the Amsterdam, ask the municipal records, or of somebody from the Amsterdam community would be able to tell you. But I'm afraid I can't.
Thanks, Miriam. Doreen Berger. Just to say out of interest, you showed the ketubah of Sir Moses Montefiore and Judith Cohen. And there, because they held, the Sephardim always held the Ashkenazim in a little bit of contempt. Although she was the daughter of the wealthiest Jewish man at that time, she's listed as a Chudeska. I'd just like to say that. So it's quite interesting to know.
Chudeska was the word that they used for
sure,
German.
to show the Ashkenazi community. Just thought I'd mention it to give an example, because that's an interesting one. Yes, although she came from a wonderful family. Sure, of course. Just shows the attitude of the time. Later on, this died out. The attitude in being published of the attitude towards it. Thank you.
Much worse when my father's youngest sister got married to an Ashkenazi. Although her father was chief rabbi in The Hague, they would not let her marry in the synagogue in Amsterdam because of that. So, and that was in the 30s. So it's much worse.
Any more questions?
I mean, I think if I could just say, I think the reverse of that, though, this assumption that everybody has to a certain day, of course, if my ancestors were here in 1730, they must have been Sephardi, is a bit the converse of that. So as well as a slight, we have our own distinctness from the Sephardim, there was also the certain romance that people have with being Sephardi is an obverse of that. Yes, people say that to me, for instance, and it's not true. I married into the community. I didn't grow up in it. Yeah.
Nigel Fidlan, can you expand a bit on the rules at the Novo Cemetery for being buried behind the boards?
These were suicides and so on, weren't they, behind the boards? Mary, did you hear that? We were asked about being buried behind the boards. Was this, were these suicides and other slightly questionable?
There was some distinction, but I don't think they worried too much about them. I don't think so. The only people who seem to have been buried behind the boards, as it were, there was a separate area, were people whose Jewish identity was faulty in some way. And that continued into the Novo Cemetery.
Thanks, Mary.
Can I just ask, are there any conversion records that are available?
I don't know about available. There was a book of conversion records that was handed to us. I don't think there's any included in the material that's at the London Metropolitan Archives. But we have a book that includes conversions, and there's also, of course, that was handed to us by the Beit Din, who also may have some records.
I think that's much more.
I mean, I think one of the early Askamot, in fact, was, as I said, not to do conversions. And I think some of the early conversions were of people who had strong Jewish family links, say a Jewish father regularizing their status rather than a conversion completely out of.
Talking about the Jewish father, because I've got members in my family where the father was Jewish and they were married in various marks, but not the mother. So I'm just wondering how strict or not strict they were, who could actually get married in various marks.
Well, I imagine that there would have to have been a conversion in that case, because, yes, they weren't that not strict, certainly. There would have to have been a conversion in that case. So there are records? Yes, and in fact, you can certainly see in the ketubot Bat Avraham Avinu. And if you look in Bevis Marks records, those marriages are listed. I mean, you can see it says a convert. Yeah.
Right, sorry, Rachel. The website Synagogue Scribes by Angela Shire and Gabby Laws is well known to many of us who can't get down to London to see the records in person. How many of the sources that you've talked about today are on Synagogue Scribes, and how complete are they on there, and how useful is that website?
I don't know is the answer. I've not...
It's a website. There's Synagogue Scribes and Cemetery Scribes, and they are websites run by Angela Shire and Gabby Laws, with whom I've dealt with many times. And I know they cover a lot of Bevis Marks records. I've used them for clients which are pre-1837 Sephardi records in London. I'm interested to know how they match up with the, you've talked about original sources, and you've sort of numbered them and named them, and which ones then are therefore, which ones have I actually used without realizing, as it were. But I guess that's
what I can suggest is I have a look at...
There's a website which has Bevis Marks records on it, and my question is how the records on that website pan to the original records that you use.
All I can suggest is having a look at the website with Bevis Marks records and doing some cross-comparing. I have to say, on a recent visit to Liverpool, I certainly found it very hard to work out from Cemetery Scribe. And in fact, I should have a word with you later about that. Yes.
Can I just add to this, Saul? It's a very, very useful site, the Cemetery Scribes. But as always, you do have to go back to your sources to make sure that it's completely correct. That's all. But it's very, very useful. Yeah.
For some years, I've been tracing my Sephardi line when I found the marriage certificate of my great-grandmother, Sarah Abendana, and she is buried in the little cemetery in Westfield College. I can go back to the 1600s through Martinez, Nunes de Martinez, Rodriguez Ribeiro, Chavez, etc. Now, as I said before, I've not been able to do much genealogy lately, but my cousin is applying to get Spanish membership, Spanish nationality, and she was going to start again, and I told her I had everything written down. I have also the Bevis Marks books, which are invaluable, and I've done a lot from that. And what I would like to know is, we have to submit proof that they have been practicing Sephardim in the shul. Now, my great-grandfather and his son were both cousins. One of them died in Jamaica, and there are records in your somewhere of his death. And there are marriages and circumcisions in your Bevis Marks books. It's absolutely wonderful. We looked at them last night. But I think that I now need to have copies of the Ketuvot. How do I get them? Do I go to the Metropolitan, and do they have copies? Because I don't think it's going to be enough just to say, well, it's written in the book. Where do we go from here? She's asked David Mendoza, and we want to present him with some material.
If the ketubah is after... what we did was we kept the ketubot following on from where Bevis Marks Records 3 ends, so that if the ketubah is... I can't remember the exact cutoff here. It was just where the volume started. It's something like 1896. Any ketubah until then, you email us and ask for it. Any ketubah older than that, you will have to get from LMA, who have them and who will copy them. So you make arrangements with them. But you need to write to us to get an authorization for LMA to make those copies for us.
So I need to write for copies pre-1896, because I've got
marriages written about in your books from 16 somethings.
Then write to us and we will authorise LMA to make the copies for you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, I'm afraid this is going to have to be the final question from Lydia.
I'm interested in the community in the 1740s and 1750s. The people I'm looking for don't seem to have been born or died there or married, but I'm wondering if you have any subscription lists or membership lists in the LMA that it would be worth my while to look at.
Miriam, what treasurers' lists are there for that era? Could you hear the question?
The period you want is the 1740s and 50s.
Have you any subscription lists or membership lists or
The thing is, if you look in the catalogue of our material as LMA and find any documents of the period that you want.
do I have to go to the LMA because it's not on the website?
Actually, if you write to me, I can probably do it from our printed copy quicker. So let me know, and I'll look into it for you.
There's no printed list on the website. I have to go.
Yes, it's a bit difficult to find any particular ones, but I've got a printed copy I can do it from. So let me know. Thanks.
Okay, so one final round of applause and it's tea break.